If we are going to do something that is so far outside of our capacity, then anything good that comes will have to be credited to God, because we're kind of buffoons about how to live in this place. And so there was this real dependence on God, and God guiding and caring and taking care of us. I'm super dependent on my community. And so that was, I think, partly because we moved to a place that was so different to where we had ever been. That happened really fast. Whereas I think if we had moved to a place that was a little bit more similar, there's not such a drastic stripping of everything, but everything was stripped away that I knew and felt confident in.
Hi, my name is Susan Smetzer Anderson. I am the senior writer at Upper House, which is an initiative of the Stephen and Laurel Brown Foundation. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Rachel Pieh Jones, the author of a fantastic book called Pillars: How Muslim Friends Led Me Closer to Jesus. Rachel shares with me during this podcast what she learned about herself and what she learned about her faith from the Muslim friends she made while she lived in Somaliland. There's a lot of unpacking that we do here in this podcast, and one of the things that we are going to do is make this into 2 podcasts. Quite frankly, there's just too many good things to talk about to keep it to one. So I hope you enjoyed today's discussion, and certainly that you will join us for the next one. Rachel, I am so excited to talk with you today. After I read your book, I was just so convicted that this was a conversation I really wanted to have, as much for myself, quite honestly, as for Upper House, just because I learned so much reading your book, and I'm still finishing reading it too. I want to spend time on it because the writing is so good, but also the points you're making are so real, and the tone that you take with what you talk about is one of a person who's on a journey of growing in their faith and loving their neighbor. And I just want to tell you thank you for writing your book. I know it takes a lot of work. So the book is called Pillars: How Muslim Friends Led Me Closer to Jesus. And Rachel's story is one that took her from Minnesota to Somaliland and also to Djibouti. So she has a lot of things to share with us about where and how that journey worked. Just to get us started, Rachel, I wonder if you could talk to us about what your growing up was like in the church. Paint a picture for us of your existence in the church and in Minnesota and going to college.
I grew up in a Christian family. We went to a Baptist church in a suburb of Minneapolis, and it was beautiful. I often look back and think I'm just so thankful for the grounding that I had in a church where love and acceptance was just the air that I breathed. I mean, there was doctrine and theology and teaching, but the emphasis was on the people in the community. And I still know men and women who, changed my diapers when I was a baby.
Oh my goodness.
And they're still praying for me, and they're still having me over for dinner and blessing my family now. And it's just really beautiful. And so, it was not perfect, my family or my church community, but it gave me so much security and a sense of being loved and grounded in goodness and the love of God and people, that then when I did feel this kind of urge to branch out of that, I felt able to, because I was grounded well, and that, as I look back, has made me so thankful. So that church was in a suburb that was has become kind of known for a lot of Somalis now in that area.
Oh, wow.
Which wasn't that way when I was a kid. But so I went from that community in a suburb that was, mostly white, and my community was mostly Baptist and very homogenous. And then I went to the University of Minnesota, which kind of was the same. But what really impacted me in terms of giving me a global vision was that when I graduated and got married, my husband and I moved into an apartment complex in downtown Minneapolis that was filled with Somali refugees. And it was close to campus. And so he was a master's student, and that's why we lived there. And then we were exposed to this whole other world of people coming from Africa, people who were Muslim, people who were refugees, and the different needs and things that they had. And because I'd had this grounding in my church community and also in my family, I have the idea of, to everyone who has been given much, much will be required. And it wasn't that I felt this requirement that I had to give, but I just wanted to give out of the overflow of what I had received, of
Mm-hmm.
love and faithfulness and goodness. And so, yeah, being exposed to Somali Muslims in that apartment complex opened my eyes to a whole nother way of being in the world. And I
Mm-hmm.
was really curious and drawn to that. So that's a
Yeah.
brief overview, I guess, of the grounding that I had and how I first encountered
Mm-hmm.
Somalis.
Yeah. So were the Somali Muslims able to speak English? Were you able to develop some friendships with them?
Yeah, so at that time, it was 1989 is when I first moved into that building. They're mostly kind of newish in terms of
Mm-hmm.
immigration, whereas now, I mean, now you have second, third generation Somalis in Minnesota who are
Right.
American. They're born here. Their English is just like mine. But at that time, they were still learning. And so one of my first relationships and friendships that I made was with a woman where I was her English tutor. And she spoke almost no English. She was working at least two jobs, maybe even
Wow.
three. She was living with her mother and two children, and her husband was still in Somalia. And so the kids, their English was better.
Wow.
And they would help. They were learning both from school and from watching a lot of WWF wrestling
Oh,
on television.
goodness.
So they would often translate for us because we couldn't communicate a whole lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have a lot of international students in the United States, especially in Madison. Oh, I shouldn't say in the United States, in Madison at the University of Wisconsin. And some of them who I've come to know over the years actually watch a lot of Sesame Street. That
Hmm.
was the way they taught themselves or began to learn English. And I thought that was just a brilliant idea. But I cannot imagine, I'm putting myself in the seat of that Muslim woman that you were talking about, whose husband is back in Somalia or Somaliland, coming here to a completely new place, and not to mention a cold place in the wintertime. I mean, there's so many things that are different about it, and forging such a new life, it must have been really daunting.
Hmm.
So what do you remember her talking to you about or observing about what she had to overcome in order to do that?
I just remember thinking that she was really, really brave and really, really
Uh-huh.
hardworking. I mean,
Mhm.
her family, they had a mattress in the living room for a couch.
Mhm.
And I knew she was working as a housekeeper at one of her jobs at a local hotel. And I think the other one as well. And so I just thought, I mean, she has come here so bravely with her mother,
Mhm.
who's elderly, and her children, and not knowing what's going to happen to her husband, not knowing what's left behind. We would try sometimes to talk about the experience of what happened, but the language barrier and also some of the trauma barrier just
Mhm.
wasn't able to ask really helpful questions that kind of got
Mhm.
into their life story personally. But
Mhm.
over time, I've heard from many different people what things were like for them, and that sense of courage, even faith, taking
Yeah.
those risks, fighting for their families. That is kind
Right.
of a thread that runs through all these stories.
Right. And one thing that really struck me about your story at this stage, you were so young. I mean, your husband was working on his master's. Is that correct?
Hmm.
So you were what, 21, 22?
Yep.
Okay. And you know what I'm going to ask next, right? And then you were pregnant, right?
Yes.
So, and you had not one, but two, two lovely babies, but you had twins. And
Yeah.
so, yes.
That was totally overwhelming. I guess we're not prone to take the easy way. So if I'm going to have a baby, I'm going to have two. If I'm going to move abroad, I'm going to move to Somalia.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's the picture I want everybody to have in their head is that you get on a plane, you and your husband decide, and I'm going to ask you a little bit about why you went. You decide that at this stage of your life with twins in tow, you're going to take this huge step and just briefly share why you decided to do this.
Yeah, I look back now and I think, would I ever counsel myself to do that as a
Mm-hmm.
I was 23 by the time we got there, but
Okay.
yeah, what were we thinking? I'm not really sure.
Right.
Well, I mean, I guess I do know, but it's daunting when I look back. I think to go to a place like that and do something like that takes a little bit of naivety and
Mm-hmm.
even some hubris and, just
Mm-hmm.
tunnel vision of this is what we're going to do and we're going to make it work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we did. So in that apartment complex, actually having the twins be born there, we were on the 22nd floor. The elevator was often broken. My neighbors were Somali, and they were wonderful because they saw me there as this, a mom by myself with these babies, and they would come over and help. They would clean the house. They would hold the babies. I mean, it was just really a lovely way to start off, although it was extremely difficult. But in that building, we learned about this place called Somaliland, which was not, it's technically Somalia. The UN has not recognized it as its own independent nation. But after the war in the 90s, the North did separate, and they have their own government, their own elections, their own currency, their own visa application process to get in. And so they really operate fairly independently. And that part of the northern region was more peaceful than the south. And I hadn't known that before, but through our friendships there, they started to let us know, hey, this is a place that you could actually live and work. Okay. And my husband had a vision of being a professor internationally. And so with his master's degree, he could teach at this school. Physics was what we first talked about him teaching there. And so through this invitation from Somalis in our building and people that we knew, we had an open door to go to this place to do something that they had asked us to do. That was really important to us. We didn't feel like, I mean, 23 years old, I don't know how to live in Somalia. I don't know what they need or want, but I did know that we wanted to contribute. We wanted to be useful. We wanted to be exposed to something different than what we had grown up in. My husband's from rural Minnesota. And so part of it was seeking adventure, right? Of course. And part of it was, just wanting to be a part of the global world, not just our limited perspective that we'd had up to that point. But we also knew that we don't know what they need. And so it was really important to us to have that invitation, to be under the authority of the local university, to have, a sponsor as the president of the university and different staff there who were going to be helping us, shepherding us, guiding us. And then we would be doing what they had asked us to do, which at that point was teach physics. Eventually it became teach English, because once you get there, that was really what everybody wanted. And so, that was kind of our motivation to go.
Right. And this is a country that was in the middle of rebuilding, right? They're trying to find good things for the younger adults in the country to do that would help them develop their skills, their strengths as individuals who could really help rebuild the country themselves. So in some ways you're trying to do just a good work of equipping, but you're doing it with the idea that maybe you don't know everything you need to know.
That was really an important vision that the university had. Was there wasn't a lot of employment yet for youth. And so by keeping them educated after high school, if they could stay in school, then they would stay out of trouble, essentially.
Right.
And even a funny story was, once we got there, my husband and there was another American professor, both two white men, and they were playing basketball in town. So they got invited to join this basketball team. And because these two white guys would be playing basketball, the whole village would come out and watch. And so at the end of they had a tournament for a couple of weeks. At the end of the tournament, the mayor of the village actually presented each of them with a local handicraft as a gift and said, thank you for participating in this tournament, because you played, our youth came and watched you and didn't make trouble during the afternoon. Not because they were so good or so talented, but they were a great distraction.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's a great distraction, maybe a little comedy relief, but I think please subscribe, like, or hit the bell to be notified when a new episode is released. You can also download this episode in your favorite podcast app. Click the link in the description below or search for the Upwards Podcast. It's so nice, though. Whenever I've been overseas only a few times and not for nearly as long as you were. You were there for 10 months during this particular stint that we're talking about. But I'm terrible at languages. I would always say something really stupid when I tried to speak the language of the people I was trying to communicate with. I remember one time I was trying to ask a couple how old their baby was, and I asked them how much their baby cost. They just looked at me like, oh my gosh. But it gave me plenty of opportunities to laugh at myself, which I think was really good. But I think in your situation, once you get embedded in a place and you walk into the place you're going to be living for the first time ever and see, oh my gosh, it's going to be my reality, I think that that brings a different level of, I don't know, sobriety, if you will, to the situations. I'll get into that in a minute, but what I wonder about is, were there any presuppositions you had about what you would find there that you found were quickly just demolished or whatever?
Yeah, so many. And some of them I didn't even know that I had them until they were demolished, or until I encountered something contrary to it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's ideas I had about Muslims
Mm-hmm.
that, women were only oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
There's ideas about Somalis as only violent, only
Mm-hmm.
pirates, only these kinds of things. There's ideas about Africa and what life will be like there.
Mm-hmm.
My husband had actually taken a trip ahead of time to come and, go to the university, make sure this is at least a little bit okay to bring his wife
Yeah.
and children to come here.
Right.
And he came home and he said, Rachel, this is way too hard for us. We cannot do this. And at the same time, I think that we should do this. He said, I think that God
Mm-hmm.
wants us to do this because if we are going to do something that is so far outside of our capacity, then anything good that comes will have to be credited to God because we're kind of
Right.
buffoons about
Yeah.
how to live in this place. And so there was this real dependence on
Yeah.
on God and God guiding and caring and taking care of us. Now I lost the train of the question.
No, that's totally fine. I think you're doing just great. The thing I want to make sure people hear from both of us is, we're not saying that you were a great person to go over and do this. So this isn't like, oh, yay, Rachel and her husband, did the sacrificial thing. And I think that kind of supposition was something that you quickly dismantled yourself. Once you got over there, you realized, wow, like your husband said, this is going to be super hard. But the reality of having to find fresh food for your kids, just doing the basic things that were so far removed from your experience in the United States. I think, in a way, once we get into those situations, what happens is we start kind of coming to terms or face to face with our essential self, the self that we've been able to kind of, I don't know, maybe not have as obviously, let me put it this way, our facade goes away. We don't have a facade that we can lean into anymore. So,
Yeah, I mean, when I was growing up here, it was really easy to, for example, be a Christian because everyone I knew was a Christian.
mm-hmm.
And it was really easy to know kind of what's right and wrong because it's
Mm-hmm.
the same thing as what everyone else is doing.
Mm-hmm.
But then all of a sudden, I'm the only Christian. I'm the only person who believes this. So then why do I believe this? I'm the only person who's doing this or
Mm-hmm.
this thing. Why
Mm-hmm.
am I doing it that way? Do I have to do it that way?
Mm-hmm.
Can I try a different way?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I definitely, one of the suppositions I came with, I think it's part of it is probably just being an American, of
Mm-hmm.
this confidence that we have as we approach the world.
Mm-hmm.
And then realizing once I got there, I really have no idea. I'm
Mm-hmm.
totally dependent for actual survival on my
Mm-hmm.
neighbors to find that
Mm-hmm.
food, to find the pediatrician when
Mm-hmm.
my kids were sick. And then, of course, like you said, the facade gets stripped away and all this ugliness comes out. My
Mm-hmm.
envy towards
Mm-hmm.
someone else, like another American woman who was learning language faster than me,
Mm-hmm.
or my comparison to my husband who was, working at the university and I'm home with the kids and wondering what my value is. And all of
Mm-hmm.
that kind of the ugliness of my
Mm-hmm.
spirit is very exposed because there's
Mm-hmm.
no um structure or there's no
Yeah.
scaffolding anymore
Right.
to hold
Right.
me up. And so as that happened and I get more and more exposed, I started to feel like, wow, I wonder if God actually knew me when God said, you know, go do this. Like, oh boy, did he really know what Rachel was like when
Mm-hmm.
that decision was made for us? Or when we made the decision, did I know all my weaknesses?
Mm-hmm.
No, I did not. But now they're exposed and
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of a mess and I'm super dependent
Mm-hmm.
on my community. And so that was, I think, partly because we moved to a place that was so different to where we
Mm-hmm.
had ever been. That happened really fast. Whereas I think if we had moved to a place that was a little bit more similar, there's not such a drastic stripping
Right.
of
Right.
everything, but everything was stripped away that I knew and felt confident in. And
Mm-hmm.
so that immediately created a dependence on
Mm-hmm.
the local people. And so anything I thought I knew, whether it was about religion or about raising kids, how to cook, how to dress, how to talk,
Yeah. Right.
all of it was gone.
Right. And how to even interpret the reactions of the people around you to you, right? It
Yes.
was such a huge culture shift there, right?
Yeah, walking to to the market in the early days. I remember this one time in particular, some stones hitting the back of my legs. And
Mm-hmm.
I thought, oh my gosh, I'm getting stoned. What is happening here? And I look up and there's these two kids in a house nearby and they're just waving, right? They're shouting out this word that I don't know yet. And I
Yeah.
realized in that moment, like, they're saying hello to me. They're not trying to stone me, but I had felt fear and then shame and then anger. And
Yeah.
then all of a sudden I realized these kids are just trying to say hello. And so when I had looked up at them, then they started waving so vigorously that one of the
Yeah.
kids actually falls off the step.
Oh no.
And then they start laughing, and then I'm laughing, and then all of a sudden we're like in a different story. The story that
Yes.
I had been telling myself was the story I'd heard about Somalia. Be afraid, you need to look out for yourself, and you should be scared and whatever. And all of a sudden I realize I'm not in the story of fear and shame anymore. I'm in a story of delight and
Yeah.
of curiosity and connection.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I later learned the word they'd been shouting was this word that meant infidel, which is kind of a way a way that they would use to refer to a white person, because
Mm-hmm.
there had been very few white people living in this village up to that
Mm-hmm.
point. And so that was just a term, and they assumed that I was an infidel. And so, that also brought up these questions of, they see me as an infidel, an unbeliever, where I'd been told that Muslims were unbelievers. Like, we have
Right.
ways of categorizing the other person that are just
Mm-hmm.
they're so kind of offensive if you really think about it, and misplaced. And so
Mm-hmm.
for me, that story is really an example of how I decided then to choose to not live in that story of fear
Mm-hmm.
and anxiety and suspicion, but to try to interpret situations through the lens and the story of curiosity, delight, what's happening here, how can I learn from this experience, and how can I
Mm-hmm.
connect instead of separate from those people.
I was so aware of that when I was reading your book too, because you are the type of person who asks a lot of questions.
Yes.
You just try to unpack everything, like the assumptions that you're bringing into the situation. And you had to, in some ways, deconstruct your own faith, which is something that's kind of in vogue now among some people. But in your case, coming into a different culture kind of shown a mirror up to you and made you wonder. My faith has taught me to think of other people as not infidels so much, but, are they saved? Are they not saved? Do they need Jesus? How do I communicate Jesus to them? And so, like, the evangelical strain of Christianity, I think, was something you grew up with. And so, in some ways, you're having to kind of interrogate that in
Mhm.
this new situation as you come into closer and closer contact with Muslims. And I had no idea. Quite frankly, am ignorant of the Muslim faith. And so, some of the things you write in your book really shock me. And can you share with us some of the things that you discovered that may have shocked you too?
Yeah, well, one idea that so many evangelicals have is that we bring Jesus with us, and we're going to give Jesus to people, and whatever that means. I mean, even that now
Yeah.
doesn't really make sense to me when I think about it. But what I learned is that Muslims believe in Jesus, and how you might define the word believe could be different between
Mm-hmm.
religions. But the Quran actually mentions Jesus more times than it mentions the Prophet Muhammad. And Jesus in the Quran has these activities of being born of a virgin, being born by the Holy Spirit, actually breathing into Mary, healing
Mm-hmm.
people, raising the dead, doing things that, oh, Muslims believe that about Jesus? I didn't
Right.
know that. I'd
Right.
never been told that. And so,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, it's a different kind of belief. They have different beliefs. They don't believe that Jesus died on the cross or rose again, although throughout history, that has been something that Islamic theologians have contested. They've gone back and forth, debated it. It's actually not just a straightforward thing. There's been deep wrestling and discussion with the Quranic text within Islamic theology. And that, again, was something I was not ever aware of. And so that was hugely significant that I did have different ideas about Jesus, but I was not introducing them to a prophet or someone that they had never heard of before.
Mm-hmm.
So then the question becomes, how do I communicate what I find beautiful and compelling about Jesus in a way that, and why do I hold on to this and they don't hold on to this, and we share a lot of other stories? So other stories that we have in common include many of our prophets: Moses, Abraham, Adam and Eve. There's even a few women that show up in the Quran, in the Bible. They're more obscure, but one of them is Hagar. One of them is Lot's wife, Queen of Sheba. They appear in both texts. And so those kinds of things I just hadn't known before, and loved learning about our intersections.
Right. It was really fascinating for me to read your discussion about Hagar. And I wonder if you could summarize a story about Hagar that we traditionally understand in the Christian faith. And then after that, you can elaborate on what you learned about Hagar through the eyes of Muslims.
Yeah. So this has been one of my...
I love this story. It's so cool.
So Hagar, Abraham and Sarah, or Abram and Sarai, don't have any children. Abram's been promised he's going to have a child. Sarah decides, hey, maybe we should try having a child through Hagar. We don't know where Hagar came from. We know she's Egyptian. And so potentially they got her when Abraham and Sarah were in Egypt, and Abraham was afraid because his wife was beautiful. He was afraid he would be killed for her. And so he said, she's my sister. The Egyptian pharaoh or king took her, and then eventually figured out, wait, this is Abram's wife. So they send her away, but they send her away with male and female slaves, donkeys, all these different things. So potentially Hagar came from there. Her name, Hagar, means the foreigner. It's not a real strong name, but she's Egyptian. She's a probably brown Egyptian woman. So she sleeps with Abraham. He actually marries her. She becomes his wife. They have a child. She's pregnant. She gets pregnant. She starts to look down on Sarah. There's some abuse that happens. We're not sure what happens. Hagar runs away into the desert. She comes to a well where then the angel of the Lord meets her. And the angel of the Lord ends up, he says, where are you going? She says, I'm running away, all these different things. And then the angel makes these promises to Hagar, or says things to Hagar about the child that she's carrying. And the angels, Hagar says, you are the God who sees me. So Hagar is interpreting this interaction as an interaction with God, not just an angel, but with the Lord. Traditionally in most English translations, the word that is given to Hagar is that her son will be a wild donkey of a man, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. So if you just read it like that, Ishmael, that her son is named Ishmael. He ends up becoming the ancestor of what most Muslims would consider their own heritage, that they've come up from the line of Ishmael. And Jews come from the line of Isaac, the later son of Abraham and Sarah. So I'm trying to make it really quick, the story.
Don't worry about it. I realized I asked you a big question, and I apologize, but I think it's so fascinating because I think this story is partly at the root of why so many of us have kind of the shorthand way of looking at Muslims as being other than us. Coming from this wild donkey of a man who lives in hostility. And what I think has come out of that is not altogether positive.
Right. So let's look at those, or think about those phrases. That's super key for the story and what I started to learn. And I had always learned, because Ishmael is this son of, this illicit relationship, where actually in their time period, that maybe wasn't such a radical thing for Sarah to do. Not the way that we think about it now in terms of giving this woman to her husband. Anyway.
It was a type of surrogacy though, right?
Right. Yes, exactly. And so two things. One, if you are a slave woman in the desert and you're told your son is going to be a wild donkey of a man, how does Hagar respond to that? Does she say, oh no, what a curse, I'm so upset? No, she worships after she hears this message. She worships God, and she says, you are the God who sees me. This God saw her, a slave woman in the desert, and promised her a strong warrior son. So Somali women who are nomadic, traditionally Somalis are a lot of nomads out in the desert. You want children and men who will fight for your survival. If you get to a well and there's someone else there and you don't get water, you die. So you need that kind of wild donkey, strong. Also, a wild donkey is free. They're autonomous. They are not controlled. They're running, in the desert. This is a good thing. for a woman like her. It's a good thing to my Somali friends to be told that. If you're living in suburban Minnesota, you do not want your son to be a wild donkey at school. That's not looked at as
No.
a good thing. But if you're Hagar, that's a good thing. And
Right.
then the other phrase of living in hostility to his brothers is also equally translatable as will live to the east of his brothers, which then the Ishmaelites do. They end up living to the east of his brothers, of Isaac. So Hagar hears this, and she hears a blessing, and she worships God. And then later we see in Genesis 25, Ishmael actually has 12 sons. There are 12 tribes that come out of Ishmael's line. And so I had always heard this idea that Ishmael, who was the ancestor of Muslims, this is a problem. What if we didn't have Islam? Wouldn't that have been better? Was kind of the idea that was taught, not necessarily explicitly, but it's definitely undergirding some ideas about Muslims, is that they're enemies and they're negative. It's a problem. And yet God blessed them. And the mother of them saw God and worshiped God. And so that really turned over for me the idea of actually God blessed Ishmael through Hagar, and then by extension, Muslims are part of that line, and there's a blessing there for them. So Isaac in the Bible, Isaac is the son of promise, but Ishmael's sons are the sons who receive blessing from God as well.
Yeah, I love that story so much, and it just makes me wonder how many other things have we come to take as scripture that are not actually the way they were originally intended. It's and I think that's the reason I've appreciated your book so much, is because you interrogate these things. And I'm going to look for one of the pages where you it's in the same area where you talk about the Old Testament prophets and people that we have in common as Christians with our Muslim friends, and that is that your learning led to more questions and a craving to dig deeper. Does a Christian need to call God God? What do we mean by God? Is Allah the same as the God of the Bible? Could a Christian pray while facing Mecca or with a headscarf on? Do Christians prostrate themselves and recite memorized prayers? Must a Christian be baptized, and how should that baptism be performed? That's a big question for a person raised in the Baptist tradition. I thought that was really a bold question that you actually wrote that down. So, do people who believe in Jesus need to call themselves Christian? What does that mean, believe in Jesus? Believe what about Jesus? What is the gospel? So a little later on, you write, I may not have all the answers. I might not even be asking the right questions. And then, what if faith is certainty and mystery? What if God is beyond knowing, full of surprise and inscrutability, yet also tangibly revealed in Jesus, the one who came to show God with us? And you admit that these questions scared you. What was happening to your firm foundation? And I love that, because I think that's at the point where God starts saying, let me tell you a different story, or let me show you more of who I really am. Because it's as those suppositions fall away, I think that we start realizing, oh, I'm not as wise or whatever as I thought I was. That's huge for somebody who's parenting twins and living in a totally different culture and trying to figure out what it is that I'm doing here, because a lot of your foundation was gone at that point. So how did the Muslim women reach out to you?
I think they saw my cluelessness. I think they knew how little I knew, most of the time without making me feel stupid. I mean, sometimes I did feel stupid, and whether it was a language faux pas like what you said, or I just knew that I was stepping all over cultural things all the time. And I started to actually just kind of own that in sort of a humorous way. And they have a great sense of humor, to generalize, but they really do. And so I could just say, you know what? That thing I just did, that's just me being a dumb American. I have no idea what I'm doing. And they're like, yeah, we know. And so just kind of, leaning into my lack of knowledge really helped. It's a daily exercise of humility. And so, they really did reach out to me, and they would help me keep my headscarf tied. In Djibouti, I didn't have to wear one, but in Somalia, every day I was wearing one, and I didn't know how to keep it on right. And so they were helping me with that. They were helping me. They would buy me clothing
Oh my
and
goodness.
like to match the right colors with the right
Huh.
pattern, so I wasn't looking like some clueless fashion inept person. They helped me cook. They would pray for me. Later on, as I developed more friendships, and we were there many years later, I had a bout with cancer in 2018. It was thyroid cancer. I came to the US for treatment, and my friends would message me that they're praying for me, and that they were gathering up for me water from the well of Zamzam, which actually the well of Zamzam in Islam is that well that Hagar was at in Genesis. And so they have a whole story about that in the Quran and in Islamic tradition, a whole story around that well. And they often consider the water that comes from it still to this day as having healing power. And so they would, collect that for me. And so there's ways that they were also seeking to bless me. And I mean, there's so many tangible examples of how I would not have survived without the friendship of women coming around, especially in Somalia, when we needed protection, when we needed wisdom and how to make choices for things. And then later, just really relationally through loneliness, parenting struggles, just really life. It didn't feel kind of like a magical thing of how do I have friendships with Muslims? It was how do I have friendships in this place? And I have other friends. I can make friends with these women too, because we're all trying to figure out life together.
I think there's an important distinction to make. You alluded to it earlier, and that is that there's the religious difference, but there's also the very fact that American culture is so very different than the culture of Somaliland. And so, and I've been struck by this before too, when I've been, for example, when we went to Ethiopia to adopt our daughter, there was such a sense of people knowing that they were part of a community, people being warm, and the connections were just, people just sat on each other's porches and talked and walked down the street together. And there was a sense of people really being kind of accustomed to just a lot of togetherness. Whereas here, I think the individualism is so strong. And, you go to another person's house most of the time if you've arranged a time to get together. Is not the whole drop-in culture is a little different now, even than when I was growing up. So I guess I'm just wondering if you felt like they were able to reach out to you just because of their culture, or was it a lot of work for them to reach out to you? Or I think at one point you wrote you were also, people were suspicious at first that you may be part of the CIA.
Yes.
Which is really kind of hard to imagine, but
right, with my twins.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think both, like, they did reach out to me, and I think it was hard because I was the foreigner who spoke with a weird accent or didn't hardly speak at all yet. I was the one who made all these cultural faux pas and didn't know what to do with food. Like, I was the hard person to love. And yet some women really did still reach out and love me. And so, yeah, they definitely thought, especially in Somalia, not in Djibouti, but in Somalia, that we were with the CIA, because why else would you move to a place like that?
Right.
And yeah, there was, I remember when the twins were born in Minnesota, my mom asked if she could spend the night. And I think she spent one night with me in the apartment. And then I said, no, I've got this. I'm going to be this American mom, can do it all by myself. It's fine. Then later in the Horn of Africa, I had another baby. And by then I'd seen this communal way of life with the women around me. I saw how they took care of each other. I saw how they were involved. And I saw how beautiful it was to not be the only person investing in my kids, but that my kids could learn from this whole community of wisdom and corporate wisdom and perspective. And so at that point, when I had this third baby in Africa, I called my mom and I said, will you come for like a month and a half?
Oh, wow.
Not just one night, but please come and stay for a long time.
Boy, that is a big change.
Yeah. And so she did. And I also had, in the house we were living in, we were upstairs. A Somali family was downstairs. They were taking care of me. That whole family downstairs was taking care of me. I had a housekeeper and a language tutor and a nanny. They were all coming over and taking care of me. And I loved it. That was so much better than being by myself, isolated. And so that sense of community really was very practical, and the women just surround and take care of each other. It was beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
When my mom left that time, actually, our landlord's wife, she stood next to me as my husband drove my mom off to the airport, and she put her arm around me and she said, "I'll be your mother now." It was just the
Oh,
sweetest thing. So
yeah. I think when you were developing these relationships, did you find like real common ground in terms of faith that went even further than the Hagar story?
sometimes, yeah, sometimes we would find similarities. Sometimes we would hit up on significant differences,
Mm-hmm.
but there was practices that were similar, like prayer
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and fasting, which in big principle, or giving is another one.
Mm-hmm.
And in principle, Christians also pray, fast,
Mm-hmm.
and give, right? But
Mm-hmm.
the way that we do it is so different. So we
Mm-hmm.
would start by talking about, yes, we both fast. But then when we would talk about how we fasted, all of a sudden these big differences would get exposed.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was also really interesting to discover how, even within something that I had sort of taken for granted, as this is what you do when you fast, was not at all how they fasted. And even a friend of mine told me, "Rachel, I think you're sinning by the way you're fasting." And that really struck me. And as I thought about it, what was happening was that I was fasting as I'd been taught,
Mm-hmm.
which was to go, only drinking water, but eating no food for a couple of days at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And so even into the night, no food at all for say 3 or 4 days, whatever. And for Muslims, they would fast all day and then at night have a big feast every
Mm-hmm.
night during the month of Ramadan, which is the month of fasting. At night, they would have a big feast. So she felt like I was missing the feasting part of fast,
Oh,
which I had never considered before as a
no.
Christian. And yet, part of fasting is then to recognize the good gifts of God in food. And I had
Mm-hmm.
neglected that as part of my practice. And so there was these ways of encountering a similarity. Okay, we're fasting, but it's different. And what can I learn from our
Mm-hmm.
difference here that will actually increase my own experience and make it better and deeper? I might not do it the same as you in the future, but I've learned something that I'm going to incorporate that will benefit me and bless me into the future.
If you enjoy conversations like this and live in the Madison area, we hope you will come to attend an event at Upper House. You can see our full program schedule on our website at upperhouse.org/events and provide some sort of witness as well to the people around you. I mean, not in the sense that you're showing off by fasting or feasting at all, but just in the sense of there's an alternative here.
Mm-hmm.
There's another way of looking at it.
Right. I mean, for them too, right? They've not been exposed to someone so different before. I
Mm-hmm.
really was extremely in the minority there as a Christian. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
99.99% were Muslim. And so for them to see, oh, okay, here's this person that we're calling an infidel, and yet she's fasting in the
Mm-hmm.
name of God. And she also believes in Jesus and has these
Mm-hmm.
prophets and Hagar and Abraham and all these people that we share. So
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean for them to think
Mm-hmm.
about me?
Mm-hmm.
And people who were open to those conversations, we would just have the most wonderful conversations. And not everyone would be open or interested even in that kind of discussion. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
there is a two-way conversation there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think your acknowledgement that you needed them
Mm,
probably also helped that to happen, right? That you didn't come in with a posture that I'm here to tell you who Jesus is because that's my job,
yeah.
right? So if you were to talk to, say, somebody who is moving to a place like Somalia and they were asking you, like, what kind of posture should I go into this situation with? What would you say?
I have three postures that I really tried to cultivate over the years, and I didn't even fully recognize it until a few
Mm-hmm.
years in. But they're definitely what I tell people now is to cultivate postures of humility, curiosity, and delight. And for me, that like starting with humility, starting with, I don't know. I don't even know what I don't know, but I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And being willing even to be embarrassed and humiliated
Mm-hmm.
and to laugh at yourself, and the humbleness that is necessary for real cross-cultural learning. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's foundational starting point, because if you're not humble and willing to be impacted by what you're going to learn, your curiosity will be meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
What's the point of asking questions or learning about this culture if you're not going to be humble enough to wonder, how might I be
Mm-hmm.
changed by this or not?
Mm-hmm.
But just to
Mm-hmm.
wrestle with it. You don't have to be changed by everything. You don't have to embrace everything, but you should be willing to at least consider it.
Right.
because these people have been living and thriving for hundreds of years like this, or thousands of years, so there's value there. Um, and then the curiosity piece of just learning to ask good questions about the local culture, the local people, yourself, the engagement that happens. I think people, if you're going to live cross culturally, you need to be willing to ask good questions. You need to learn the local history, the folk tales, the proverbs, like what are the undergirding values of the system here? And if you're not willing to learn that stuff, well, why go? I mean, what's the point?
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, that's foundational. And then delight, like all of that is not building to some kind of fighting nature or us versus them nature or I've got it figured out now kind of thing, but just delight. Like, can we enjoy what we're learning about this other culture? Can we enjoy each other? Can they enjoy me in my difference? And how can we expand our experience of life and self and God and community in ways that are just really delightful and enjoyable? I feel like sometimes people get really mired down and this is hard and this is, so much work and effort, and it is, but there's real delight there.
Well, I enjoy meeting you a lot here, and I don't often get to talk to an infidel. So thank you so much for sharing this time with me. Yes, happy to bring it. I'm really excited that you and I get to talk some more, because there's just so many things I want to unpack with you, ask you more about, and I really appreciate your time today. So
my pleasure.
All of the notes from this podcast will include at the bottom, where you can link to them, especially Rachel's book. And please join us again on the Upwards. We have one more time with Rachel. Thanks.
Thank you.